The following is a preview of the New Models podcast.
From Berlin to your block since 2018.
Full episodes are available only to subscribers, and there's hundreds more in our archive.
Join now on newmodels.substack.com or patreon.com/newmodels.
And you know the New Models Discord is popping. Patreon only. Stop sleeping and subscribe now.
New Models, you won't get it anywhere else. You're now locked in with New Models.
Hi, and welcome to New Models. On this episode, we're joined by University of Amsterdam media scholars Sal Hagen and Daniël and Sal, who have been closely tracking the weirder end of the internet for over a decade. Their research and analysis of 4chan has made them low-key legends within internet studies. Last year, along with Tommaso Venturini, they published a paper called Digital Rhythmanalysis, studying memetic and affective rhythms on the post-viral web, in which they proposed a framework to, quote, better approximate the logics of many new native digital cultural processes, including fuzzy affects and pulsing, emergent, and ephemeral vibes, unquote. As 4chan's logic becomes the prevailing logic of social media, it should not be a surprise that Sal and Daniel's work offers some of the most illuminating models for our contemporary communication space that we've encountered. Do you want a hardcore academic paper on Psyop realism? What about a journal article that seriously maps out, across the web, the political connotations of based? Are you bored of scholars mired in representational readings of internet content, yet left wanting more from a totally content-agnostic understanding of how we communicate now? Have you ever wondered how it is exactly that we scan and sense our way through all of the information that we encounter on screen? Have you ever wondered how it is exactly that machinic systems sense us back? If so, these are your guys. We are extremely thrilled to share this episode with two of our favorite vibe-pilled scholars of the extreme and extremely online. If at times it gets a little dense, just imagine it's a wiki article and write down the keywords to look up later. It will be worth it. Sal Hagen and Daniël and Sal are founding members of the University of Amsterdam's Open Intelligence, or OILab, and they're our guests today on New Models. I'm Lil Internet, joined by my co-host Carly Busta. Let's get into it.
Sal Hagen and Daniël and Sal, welcome to New Models.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You are joining us today from the Netherlands, calling in from the University of Amsterdam's Digital Methods OILab or OILab. What is that?
OILab, yes. I think it used to stand for Open Intelligence Lab. At one point, there was also the quip that data is the new oil, so that also referred to that.
Right.
But I don't know.
Let's say the naming was done in the spirit of trolling of the kind of research that we were doing at the time, around 2016, when Trump got first elected.
Yeah, I was doing a master's at the time, doing some projects with digital methods during the winter school together with Mark Tutors. Tried to make sense of this weird alt-right moment where suddenly sort of this optimism about internet subcultures, online movements, memes kind of got reversed by reactionary movements online. So that we started this group called the Alt-Right Open Intelligence Initiative, which then turned into OILab.
How would you describe the lab's focus at this point?
So we've never been like an official group. We've never had formal funding as a group. I think most of us have focused on reactionary far-right movements for a long time. And then either because things have changed, but also, Twitter is 4chan now and things have normalized a lot. I think most of us are now focusing more on these sort of environmental or affective or temporal dimensions that still really relate to internet subcultures. But it's a bit more free-floating at this point.
For myself, I can maybe take a further step back because I was researching Anonymous in the early 2010s. And this was the moment around Occupy and Arab Spring where there was still this kind of celebratory spirit around digital culture. And then I went on to do my PhD on anonymous image board cultures, starting in 2014. Around that time, few people had heard what 4chan even was. And then during my PhD, the alt-right happened and everyone knew 4chan, but thought it was just a bunch of neo-Nazi trolls, which was obviously partly true. And now I think we're entering a phase where maybe people don't really know 4chan anymore because the kind of cultural paradigm has shifted. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
In a way, 4chan, though, is just percolated through all of our media. So
Been a 4chanification of social media.
Yeah.
And I think really because of the recommendation feed mechanic generally, but I think we'll talk about that later. One thing I realized, actually talking about oil, data is the new oil, and maybe this is dumb that I just realized this, maybe this was always the analogy, but because of the Iran war, there's been all this discussion about oil supplies. It's actually, oil is refined into plastic feedstuffs and medication and fertilizer and gasoline for cars and jet fuel and heating fuel. Yeah. And so it's like taken as this raw material and then made into like countless different source materials for a large chunk of human activity. And so data being the new oil started to make sense to me more in that regard. It's like you can do all these different things with it rather than something related to like scale or economics. I don't know if that was always what the analogy was supposed to allude to or not. Was it?
I don't know. I think we didn't really run with the analogy because it kind of echoes this, raw data idea, which is an oxymoron, as we know.
Especially with AI, with these AI models that use vast amounts of training data, where the training data is basically the internet, including maybe even 4chan, but definitely Reddit. This analogy with oil refining is still there. Like all of this data gets compressed and abstracted into embeddings and into these large language models. So it's definitely the new phase of where big data feeds into these algorithms, but they've become generative, right? They've came to produce language itself.
But this is really good because one of the reasons why, well, we're excited to have you guys on for many reasons, but
first of all, because they're the goated internet studies, media theorists, whatever. Like if you're really deep, you like know these names. You're like very excited as soon as you saw them pop up on the feed.
Yes. But I think also probably nobody has a better model of what this strange era of media is in their minds than you two. And one of the reasons why we did want to speak to you is we've been chipping away at this idea of what we've been calling neural media after Kay Alado McDowell. For us, it was this kind of media that comes out of and after network media, this kind of non-conscious thinking where we're not so much directing content as directed by it in an unconscious way. We spoke with Peli Greitzer a couple of weeks ago who said, hey, listen, in high dimensional space, a vibe actually has a shape. It actually is an objective mathematical object. And that was pretty crazy. And then Julian found some work you've done recently, specifically a paper you did in the fall, where you said, at scale, the internet flows in a way that's rhythmic. And maybe if we start in a Lefebvre way, start listening to these internet flows, we can sort of start to model the way that these machinic systems interpret what we do or see what we do or instrumentalize what we do. And there's this idea of post-discursive media that you two have been working with. And that's an interesting alternate way or maybe more efficient way of speaking about this era of media. I mean, I know in media circles it's probably really well known, but since it's so central to what both of you do, could you guys explain to us, like, what is post-discursive media?
Yeah, so for me, it came about through a kind of discontent with the notion of post-truth, which goes back to this earlier cycle of 2016, where it was all about questions of fake news, mis and disinformation, and there was a lot of moral panic and anxiety around this notion of social media. But of course, there were always a lot of problems with this concept in the way that it still imagines the internet as a kind of public sphere where there are these normative epistemic expectations of publicness, and this is being distorted and this is being polluted, and what can we do against this? Whereas I think post-discursive media or post-representational media draws it a bit broader. It's not even like, oh, online content is not about truth or fact, like we know that, but it's more broadly operating below the kind of level of conscious or intersubjective symbolic interaction. So it's operating increasingly in this kind of what you call neuro modality, which I don't think is necessarily connected to neural nets, to AI. I think there's other ways of imagining digital media going way back before the resurgence of AI. So I think that the post-discursive emphasizes this kind of sub-representational level, but it also signals the kind of operational relation that we have to digital media, which feeds into this notion of weaponization. Like post-truth, weaponization still kind of assumes that there's like a non-weaponized modality of information, but that's more and more difficult to maintain. So it's almost like weaponization has become baked into our everyday online interactions. And that's what I'm particularly interested in which I think that the notion of post-truth has become too weak to really capture.
I'm going to ask you to expand on weaponization, but first, Sal, did you want to follow up with your thoughts on post-discursive?
I came at it slightly differently when finishing my PhD on 4chan poll and understanding why this radical collective kind of sticks and has an identity, even though it's ephemeral and anonymous. After those 4 or 5 years, what I just got a sense of is that the representational or even the literate side of things, I mean, it's still mostly a textual forum, didn't matter as much in contrast to sort of the rhythmic dimensions of memes and claims and images just being repeated and circulating, things being said in different words, but sort of having the same ideological baggage. And that made me think about what the tendencies that internet researchers also have, which is still quite focused on textual objects and sort of things that you can repurpose to do internet research. Indeed, the whole idea of, network publics and following friends and followers just seems out of place in light of my study of 4chan, because you couldn't really apply those logics. But then as I continued into the postdoc, I also realized that that same intuition or that same shift was also kind of happening by virtue of deep learning and recommendation algorithms being integrated in more and more platforms, where suddenly looking at individual pieces of content didn't really tell you much in light of the more distributed and environmental and temporal dimensions of them. Of course, TikTok is kind of the example here. But yeah, with Daniel, we try to translate that same framework to this peculiar moment where these kind of secondary oral, temporal dimensions seem to be taking hold of the internet more and more.
That makes a lot of sense. I feel like what you're saying is a lot of the critique and analysis of what the mainstream might call like the edgier side of the internet, like the problematic side. There's always a focus on content, a representational translation, interpretation of what's going on, a study of network logic of like who likes it, who passes it along. And what both of your research concludes is that that's still too superficial. Like that still doesn't quite get at like what's actually propelling the patterns and the behavior that we're seeing. What I love is a really clear definition of why post-discursive, why discursive in general. And maybe we get there through this thing that I guess is like maybe now common ground among your circle, this idea of taking a representational approach versus an operational approach to studying a piece of media. And I guess, Daniel, in your most recent paper, you say, right, and that division itself is actually also too superficial because something like a meme contains both a representational and an operational dimension, and they kind of inform each other. But before we get more complex, maybe you could just spell out what those two registers are and how we then get to this idea of something being post-discursive.
Yeah, so maybe I can try to get at it from the digital rhythm analysis angle. So what digital rhythm analysis is designed to do is to really capture and listen at this post-discursive media spaces. And by that, we kind of mean as you mentioned, the kind of rhythmic flows of content as they move across different platforms, but also the sense in which they revolve more around crafting ambient or affective atmospheres, where the point is a certain mode of attunement between user and content, which doesn't pass us through the conscious register of representation, but almost acts in this kind of neural sense in the missing half second of experience.
So that's neither operational nor representational. It's even zooming out farther. It's seeing how maybe the interaction of these two things produce an ambient space. But could you, in a very simple terms, I think a lot of our listeners, if I use myself as a litmus test, I had not thought about it. I keep trying to say content is empty. The content layer, it's more valuable for how people interact with it than anything that it contains. And just thinking that way was helpful, but I feel like I was hitting a wall. I wasn't able to really explain why that was so very different until I saw, there's a representational approach to thinking about, let's say, a meme and an operational one. A representational one would look at the aesthetics of the image, would look at the language that's used, the comments that people make about it, would try to interpret it like you'd interpret a work of art and a gallery, thinking about it having specific political meaning, aesthetic meaning, it really operating in a human sphere through human vision. It would be something that would be connected to a human canon, cultural context, history, biography, right? This register. And yet the operational approach is something that says, you can do that, but no one's even going to see your critique because the entire circulation system is kind of broken. So we really need to think about this object in terms of its capacities to circulate, to enact a program. How is it agentic? Agentic is this term we keep hearing, right? How is an image agentic? That's really the framework. Yeah. And how does the machine see it? And how does it pull on affect, as to speak with Maurizio Lazzarato, this enslaved user, enslaved to the machine? How does it extract from us in order to operate? And so these two different approaches, then you say, yes, these are two ways of looking at a piece of content. You're saying these two registers, they actually have to be read together because it's really the interaction of these two that creates this larger space, this atmosphere, this vibe, this pulse, this flow, this thing that maybe is even beyond these two registers, which is actually the place where we should be reading how media flows, how it directs, where it gains power. Is that even right? Maybe it's wrong, but if you could correct that or say it more succinctly in your own words, I think it would be a really useful concept for people to wrap their head around.
I can maybe elaborate a little bit on how I see the distinction between the operational and representational view of digital culture. So there's this video artist, Haroon Farooqui.
Of course.
Yeah, who introduced this notion of operational images. And so for him, these were the kind of video footage that was used by self-guiding missiles to reach their target. And he says here the image becomes purely a technical image. It's no longer meant to represent anything to human beings. It doesn't pretend to be true or false or meaningful or represent an external reality, but it's totally integrated into the technical procedure itself. It has a purely operational meaning because it helps the missile reach its target. So for me, the distinction between operational and representational goes back to two different lineages of thinking about information and a kind of ambiguity in our understanding of information, which can be historically explained. And I go back to kind of the history of cybernetics and original information theory in order to locate where this ambiguity comes from. So in the kind of representational tradition, information is just a semantic carrier of meaning, which can have a truth content or not. And this is kind of the liberal humanistic tradition of thinking about information that also projects into the internet this idea that the internet is a digital public sphere. But then if you go and look how, for example, someone like Claude Shannon, a cybernetic mathematician who is at the origin of information theory in a computational sense, he defines information in a very, very different way. And so in his book on that, there's an introduction by Warren Weaver, who's like this cybernetic scientist who's also working on this. And he defines communication as one way in which one mind can affect another. And then he quickly kind of corrects himself and say, well, instead of mind, you could also say machine. So the definition of information and communication in this tradition is much more operative in the sense that it allows you to control some kind of process at a distance. And this is embedded in this kind of Cold War complex of technoscience and finding like solutions to the problem of how can we calculate or intercept, again, a missile that is fired at us, or how can we simulate thermonuclear war, something like that. So you're very far removed at this point from thinking about information as kind of signifying surfaces or kind of human readable information. It's much more about how information can control things at a distance and is operative. So it's part of a technical intervention that also creates reality. And here the internet is more inherently imagined in militarized terms, so not a public sphere, but more like a theater of operations. And this is, I think, where a lot of vernacular digital culture picks up on that. And they're actually more digitally literate than most misinformation scholars, is that they see this idea, they understand that memes are not...
If you've made it this far, you already know New Models is for you. Subscribe now at newmodels.substack.com or patreon.com/newmodels for all of our full episodes and the hundreds more in our archive.